We're going to give it just a few, another minute or so to let a few more people join in. Really excited to have both Marc from Scalar and Samy from GitBook with us here to talk all things open source. As a bit of background, we had recently partnered with Scalar, and we've also been working on expanding our open source offering at GitBook to give a lot more ways as you as a developer to help contribute not only to things like documentation, but also the GitBook platform as a whole. And we've invited Marc here to talk with us about some of the processes behind that and some of the decisions, and also give you a bit of a sneak peek on what's to come and what we've been working on over the last couple of months. So yeah, really excited to dive in. We'll dive in just a few more seconds. Feel free to also post in the chat if you have any questions, or let us know where you're tuning in from. I think it's going to be pretty interesting to hear where everyone is tuning in from. Cool. Yeah, I think we've got a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and dive in. And let's start by introducing again the host. So as I mentioned, I'm joined by both Samy, founder of GitBook, and also Marc, one of the founders from Scalar. Let's start with a quick round of introductions. Samy, I don't know if you want to give us a quick kind of introduction about yourself, but maybe it'd be interesting for the audience to know kind of maybe your background in tech, like how you got started into coding and also working on products in general.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Samy, the co-founder and CTO of GitBook. So I started the company around 8 years ago. Before that, I was already building a bunch of tech companies and mainly DevTools company, an online code editor and some other tools. I started programming when I was around 16, 18, like a lot of people at the time, building video games and building side projects and publishing them online, and kind of the origin of kind of before GitHub started to exist. And at GitBook right now, as CTO and founder, I'm leading our product development. So taking care of everything from the product roadmap to also managing kind of the week-to-week, day-to-day execution to make sure that we can build the best product for all of our users.
Awesome. Do you remember the first application or program that you built? Was it a game?
Yeah, it was a game. At the time, there was like the PlayStation Portable, and there was a way to kind of hack it and run some Lua code on it. So a program kind of, the first language I learned was Lua, and then I went into kind of C and different languages. But yeah, the first thing was trying to kind of just have a quick game on my PSP that I can show to my friends.
Yeah. Nice, very cool. And Marc, yeah, I don't know if you want to give a quick introduction. Also, I'm pretty curious to know your kind of history in tech and how you got started as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to be here. So yeah, I'm Marc, one of the co-founders and the CEO of Scalar. We started Scalar about 1.5 years ago. Before that, though, my co-founder and I, Cam, we started a company called LaunchCo. It's a website builder. We sold it to Namecheap.com, and that was like probably my first official like job doing like actual software programming. But the first time I actually got into coding was in my first year of computer engineering. And but the first project was actually open source. I like got back from my first year at university, watched the movie Iron Man, and saw that Jarvis thing, always on voice controlled. Cool feature, and I was like, dang, I'd love to have this myself. Looked online, and some people already built it, which was great, on GitHub. And yeah, I reached out to them, and that was my first actual project, was contributing to it's actually Charlie Marsh. He's the creator of Rough. It's called Jasper. It's an always on voice controlled application. So that was in Python, and it was super fun.
Super cool. So you didn't build a video game, but you basically built an Iron Man suit, it sounds like.
No, I built like a Twitter and a Google Calendar integration to Jarvis, but I love it.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, we got a lot to talk about, and I have a lot of questions to ask both of you, not only about like GitBook, Scalar, but a lot more of like the history of both companies and how you've both been contributing to open source in general. I wanted to, I think, just give a little bit more context, or ask you for a bit more context for the people tuning in and for also the recording. I think, Samy, a lot of people might know what GitBook is used for nowadays, and a lot of people might have their documentation hosted on here. But I'm curious if you can give us kind of a timeline from the inception of GitBook, from when you first started working on it to where it is now. Was it always about a documentation platform, or maybe give us a little bit more context there?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I mentioned, I think we started GitBook around 8 years ago, maybe a bit more. So at the time, it really started as a side project. So we were building a dev tool company, so trying to build kind of an open source code editor. And as a side project, I was starting to write some content online, some tutorials about how to create an operating system from scratch in C++. The content is still online. It's terrible content, but still on GitBook. And there was no good solution to kind of generate a nice looking website from a long form content and basically from Markdown files. There was a bunch of solutions in the market to generate blogs. There was Jekyll from GitHub and some other kind of static website generator, but mainly targeting blogs. And there was nothing to kind of generate some form of a kind of book experience. Where you could go through from one page to another, you could generate a PDF and stuff. So the first version of GitBook was really trying to kind of create online books and ebooks from Markdown files. That's why the name is GitBook, and the name sticks because it was it worked quite well with our audience and the relationship with GitHub. But we started mainly with books and mainly with one book. And for first release, we published a bunch of other content around writing JavaScript and doing kind of web development. And it quickly got some traction. And I think the main thing is, as an engineer, we want to write Markdown files in GitHub, and we want to get something generated from it. We want to write it the way we code, and we want the rest to be automated and to be good looking at the end. So inspired by kind of all the other open source tools, we went from there and kind of created GitBook specifically for this job. It quickly gained some traction from the open source community, and over a few months we saw a lot of diverse projects starting to use it. I remember at the time there was a bunch of open source projects from Airbnb directly being published on GitBook for their documentation, a bunch of React libraries. And then we saw also some researchers in top universities using it. So a lot of very diverse usage and use cases for the products. And it was still a kind of hard to use CLI that you could download from NPM and run it and generate the website. And then you had to do something with the website, host it on GitHub Pages or somewhere else. So when we looked at the kind of broader problems around maintaining documentation or kind of publishing content online, and when we looked at the problems that this organization were facing, we saw that there was kind of the need for a more complete knowledge management solution that was really designed for technical teams. And so we kind of took all the principles that are built in GitHub on like change management and having a Git history, and we built this into a solution that was more designed for knowledge and documents more than for code. And we kind of transformed GitBook as a SaaS platform. First still compatible with our open source CLI, and then kind of growing it to something more optimized for the problems we were trying to solve. And now we have dozens of thousands of organizations managing their documentation on a daily basis using GitBook. So it's amazing to see kind of 8 years is a long time, but it's also a very short time for all of this.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's kind of cool to hear also how it's evolved from more of like the initial conception of it, where it was mostly people sharing kind of guides and tutorials, into using it for more dedicated documentation, etc. Marc, can you give us a quick introduction on what Scalar is and what you guys are doing over there?
For sure. So Samy's at like the 8-year mark, much further along. We're at the other end of the spectrum, at the like genesis of the company. So yeah, we're Scalar. We're doing pretty much tooling all around APIs with a really big focus on open API. So we launched in October of last year. If you're familiar with Swagger UI or Redocly, we released a much more modern alternative version to that. we're on top of Hacker News in October, and since then we've just been heads down, really focused on building tooling all around APIs. So we started with documentation for Open API, and inside of that we have a really fun testing feature, which is what Samy and I first started talking about when we met last year, and we're going to be releasing that as a standalone app. So pretty much Scalar is just focused on API tooling, but with a lot of focus on Open API specifications.
Awesome. And yeah, that's also really cool to hear. And also as like a developer and using APIs, I'm actually kind of curious, like in your opinion, what do you think sets Scalar apart from other platforms like you mentioned, like Redocly or something similar?
It's one of the big things that people get really excited about with Scalar is the customization. So we have everything is completely stylable. It doesn't feel like when you go to Scalar docs, it doesn't feel like you're looking at Scalar. It could be any kind of embedded, for example, deeply on GitBook. It doesn't really feel like it's Scalar and GitBook. It's just GitBook has this amazing testing feature now. So that's one of the big things people are excited about. The other one too is we integrate so simply with your REST framework. So if you're building with Fast API or Lightstar, or I think .NET version 9 is coming out with Open API support, or actually they are coming out with Open API support out of the gates. So integrating Scalar is incredibly simple with your backend framework too. And also people really love the testing functionality. So it's really fun to like get quick docs and then quickly test your APIs too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know what you mean by the test it functionality, because that was one of the biggest, I think, feature requests at GitBook, especially even when I had started using the platform. So it's really, really exciting to have it now, which I think we're going to show off in a little bit if you haven't used it before. I wanted to dive in a little bit more to the open source kind of background from both Scalar and both GitBook. And Samy, I know you mentioned when you had started GitBook, it was like an open source project at first. And back in April, we had relaunched parts of GitBook into an open source kind of framework. But I wanted to ask if you could give some context on why that was important for yourself, but also as GitBook, as we head back into open source, let's say.
Yeah, I think along the years, we went through a lot of different stages for GitBook. We started as a very simple open source tool written in JavaScript, and then we became kind of this full SaaS solution, fully closed source, with some minor parts being open source. And I think we saw a lot of benefits by kind of going closed source at the time, because of the stage of the company, to make sure that we could iterate faster, that we could build the core of a product in a more efficient way. But a lot of it, looking back, were kind of not necessarily mistakes, but some stuff that we could have done it a different way. And we always knew kind of our origins are in the open source community, and we always had a deep relationship with open source. We've been used by thousands of open source projects to build their documentation, and as a team of engineers, we still publish countless packages on NPM and other platforms. So it's when we looked at the opportunity recently to kind of rebuild how we render published documentation on GitBook, we wanted to make it more performant, more modern, to use different technology, and to make sure that it was going to be more competitive against how the market evolved, and really aligned with the vision that we have for the next few years. We saw it as kind of an evidence that we needed to build it in the open. So for us, there was kind of two main reasons to build it and release it as an open source project. The first one is ideologically, origins are deeply related to open source, or engineers use and build open source projects all the time. And if we can work in the open, then we should do it. If it can help a few engineers outside the company to be inspired by something we've done, or to get a bit more creativity on how they're trying to solve their own problems through a solution that we implemented, then it's a great thing. And we kind of help make the world a better place, kind of one repository at a time. And the second one is kind of more on a strategic level. Like we have a lot of open source projects that are publishing their documentation on GitBook, and it was always an important source of visibility for GitBook. We started this way. We started by getting a lot of users, because all these projects had their documentation on GitBook, and it was attracting new projects to move their documentation to GitBook. And now, in the past few years, by focusing on our SaaS offering, we've been able to iterate fast, but we also saw a new set of solutions appearing in the market that were inspired by GitBook, that are doing amazing stuff. For example, Docusaurus or Nextra. And to kind of better serve our users, we need to be able to offer the same type of features, the same way to customize our documentation to an extent that was not possible by having just a closed source solution. We also need to have more trust being built with the open source community. We need to show that how it works, how GitBook works, and that we are not trying to vendor lock, or that we're not trying to kind of build with some stuff that are non-standard. So for example, when looking at API documentation, investing into open API was an evidence for us as well, because it's an open standard. It's a spec where a lot of companies like Scalar are building on top and are building amazing things. And for us, we didn't want to build something specific to GitBook or specific to some other solution. We want to build something that will be in the open, something that you can combine a lot of different solutions. So it's not just about the code being open source, it's also about like this kind of standard and specification that we use.
Yeah, that's cool to hear, and also makes a lot of sense, especially when you take a look at, I mean, even if you take a look at a lot of open source projects, and I personally have seen a lot using GitBook, I know it makes a lot of sense to kind of start to return to those roots and and start to give back to these types of communities. And I want to ask you also, Marc, something pretty similar in terms of how your journey with open source. I've also been, I mean, I know that you're a pretty big open source contributor, as I've been following you for the last couple of months on Twitter. And if you follow Marc on Twitter, you definitely know that he's a big contributor in the space. But yeah, I'm curious to hear kind of your experience with it over the last couple years or since you started programming, and how you've seen Scalar kind of fit into the space as well.
For sure. I think a lot of the things that Samy touched on, which are like, some of the tenets of open source, which is it's open, there's no vendor lock-in, everyone can see. Obviously, there's a whole side journey on licensing we could talk about, but I think one of the really cool things about open source is that it's just open and anyone can look at it, anyone can fork it. It's pretty much the reason why I was able to accelerate all of my programming knowledge, was looking at repos. Like, I remember seeing GitBook way back in the day when it was open source and being like, holy smokes, this is such a massive repo. There's so much stuff going on. I read GitBook documentation all the time, and the whole project is open source. So for me, open source, like you said on my Twitter, I'm just a really big fan of it. I love seeing people build in the open. I really think that it's just so wonderful for everyone. I also think for competition, I think it's great. It moves faster for everyone. You can see what's going on. But then the really big one is for us, it's trust too. So for example, we integrate with a lot of people's backend REST frameworks, and that's just running like on their servers. If Scalar was closed source, it would be such a non-starter for us to get in, to be able to actually render docs there. So open source I've been contributing to open source for almost 10 years now. I love open source. I love it so much, actually. And I'm so grateful that Scalar is able to be open source first, which is why when we launched in October, it was such a big moment for us as a company. And most of our products are open source. So we built a modern open API parser, which we released, which a lot of really big organizations are already using. And then our new dedicated API client, which is like a Postman alternative, will also be fully open source. And it's just been such a huge catalyst. And it's why Samy and I were able to connect and kind of get integrated so quickly. Everything was just open. And so, yeah, you could see last night, I think I opened Amrit, one of the staff engineers at Scalar. We opened a pull request and then it got merged while I was sleeping. To my surprise, I was stoked. So yeah, the new Scalar client is updated in GitBook, and that kind of stuff just doesn't happen in closed source when you're on separate organizations.
Yeah, that's super cool to hear. And I think it's going to be cool to see some of that in action. And I just want to mention to the audience as well, if you have any questions, I see some in the chat right now. If you have any questions for Marc or Samy, feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll get to those after a couple more questions I have for both of you, and then we'll dive into demos, and then we can dive into the Q&A. I wanted to ask you, Samy, as well, in terms of like returning back to the open source roots. Can you talk like what parts of GitBook are open right now? And maybe it'd be interesting for the audience to know like what types of things they can contribute to GitBook and kind of what to expect in that area.
So the biggest part that we have open source at the moment is our rendering engine. So basically, it's the whole part that is taking the GitBook content and rendering the published documentation. So it's a whole front end for the documentation and with more advanced features in it. So this whole part is a Next.js application built with kind of modern technologies and TypeScript and Tailwind and a lot of stuff that are becoming very common on the market. And that's the main thing where people can contribute on. They can build features on it. They can help improve the styling. They can help improve the accessibility. They can help translate it into different languages. We saw different GitBook users contribute in different ways, even by just opening an issues on the repository. And then we have a lot of other packages that are open source, from parsers we built or libraries we built that have been released open sourcely. The core of the GitBook application is closed source at the moment, because it was built from the start as closed source. And when you build a kind of closed source repository, you end up kind of building it in a way that is kind of hard to go back to open source. It's possible, but you built it to be optimized to go to production and not necessarily to be reproducible and deployable on many different environments. But yeah, the main part is open source is our rendering front end.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the overview. Yeah, it'd be really cool to see if there's anyone in the audience here that's interested in contributing. And you can head to github.com/gitbookio, and you can find some of our projects there and definitely help contribute anything that you find valuable. Marc, I have a question also for you in terms of open source and how that's played out with, maybe not necessarily, it could be tied to Scalar, but also any of the other open source projects you've worked on in the past. But as you start to build an open source product, what do you think are some of the hardest parts to keep in mind as you continue to build it? Or what are some of the issues maybe that you've faced in the past as you've built open source projects?
No, it's a great question. This is definitely the biggest open source project that I've ever been kind of leading. We grew to, I think we're like over 5,000 stars already. We have like crazy usage. Transparently, we have so many integrations. So we have Next, we have Nuxt, we have Lightstar, we have Fast API, we have all of these integrations. So I think one of the biggest things has been not breaking stuff across. So this is probably unrelated to open source as a whole, but we just have so much usage across so many different frameworks. And even though it's quintessentially JavaScript, there are a lot of intricacies where maybe Next.js releases something where they change something with their headers being passed through, or maybe we have all these dependencies and all these different integrations where it makes it a little bit tricky there. But I think a lot of people often have a hard time with balancing inbound requests and dealing with maybe not feature requests, but bug reporting and just managing that in and of itself. I personally love it. And I love chatting with our users and understanding what's going wrong and seeing how they're integrating with it. So for me, it's just been almost purely positive in that regard. And I would say, yeah, the biggest one is just us making sure we're not breaking things across our integrations. But
yeah. I could definitely imagine how that's that might be a pretty big thing to keep in mind as you and others are working on the product. So yeah, I'd like to dive into some demos and also see more kind of hands-on stuff on what's all the stuff that we're talking about, but also show the audience a little bit more about the integration that Scalar has built with GitBook. So yeah, I don't know, Samy, do you want to start and give kind of a demo on, again, the integration we're talking about, and just kind of dive into it that way? Let me stop sharing my screen as well.
Yeah. I'll share my screen and show you a bit more about how we've built better open API integration in GitBook and how we've leveraged Scalar for this. And I will let Marc demo more the Scalar part. So I think on GitBook, let me share my entire screen.
It could also be nice to talk a little bit about like the context on where it was coming from as well, and kind of where it ends up now too.
Yeah. So for us, API documentation market has always been extremely interesting. We have most of our customers and most of our users are publishing open source docs or product docs on GitBook. But one key part for a lot of software companies is to develop an API and to document this API. And as we see more companies investing into open API, it was clear that for us, investing as well on the open standard and how and using open API was key to help people document API on GitBook. You can always document an API by writing the content manually and create a bunch of headings, code blocks, and explain to your users how to use your API. You can also invest into writing a great open API spec and then synchronize it with GitBook to render it to your users. So for example, one well-known example of open API is a pet store API, which is if you go on petstore.swagger.io, you have this kind of open API spec with a lot of different endpoints. And so in this example, I'm going to show you how you can build this API into GitBook. So you have this content that is published on GitBook, this site is on GitBook, and it has a space, which is the content in it. So I'm going to edit this content and I'm going to integrate some open API blocks directly into the content. So I'm first creating a change request, and there I can create a group for my API. I can quickly name it API. And in the page there, I will be able to integrate some endpoints from the API. Oops, sorry. So I'm going to type open API in the command palette to insert a new block. And I'm going to select the source and I'm going to select a URL. So we have two different types of source you can have for an open API block. It could be a URL. In that case, every time the URL is changing, every time we render the documentation, we are going to get the content of the URL and we are going to render the block with it. Or you can use a file that you upload on GitBook. So in that case, I'm going to put a URL and I can select all the API operation that are defined in my open API spec. So for example, this one and this one, and I'm going to click insert. And directly here, I can see some documentation for the app operation. So I can see the entire block here representing my open API operation and the block below. I can change the operation associated to the block if I want to, and I can also write content around the block. So for example, I can use our new AI integration to write some quick introduction about the API. In that case, I have some paragraph here where I can do normal editing. So our goal was always to make sure that you can embed your API documentation with normal content and not just have an API reference that's going to be a list of all of your API endpoint with missing context, because we find it to be extremely valuable for the end users to be able to read the API reference and jump into some explanation and more content or more product documentation. So a lot of our customers are mixing their API documentation with their product documentation because all of this is part of the same context that the end user need to understand to use the API or to use the product. So I can quick preview to see how it renders on published content. So in that case, I get this page. I can click on page 1 here, and I will get this public page that contains my documentation and the open API block. And on this block, it's fully interactive and lets the user explore the whole schema of data here. Some stuff are customizable. So for example, if I go back into this block and I'm going to delete this block, I'm going to insert an open API block coming from my local computer. So I will select the openapi.yaml file here. It's going to be uploaded compared to the URL source that I used before. And I'm going to select the post on /pet. And I'm going to insert this block. So I have this block here. If I want to customize the code samples that we display on the side, GitBook offers different solutions to do so. So I can open my OpenAPI spec, and there for this specific endpoint, I have some custom properties I can set on. So this custom properties is x-code samples. In that case, I can decide to either disable the code sample by putting false. If I do so, the code samples will be invisible on the page, or I can define some custom ones. Let's say that I have a JavaScript SDK to use my API. I can put the source of how to use the JavaScript SDK for this. I can save, and then I can update my OpenAPI spec. So instead of updating the block, I can just update the entire file. And you can see that the block has been updated automatically. So in that case, it shows only one code sample, which is the one I've defined into my OpenAPI spec. So this is one way our customers are documenting API on GitBook. Is either they reference a URL that contains their OpenAPI spec, or they maintain one file in their GitBook space that is the OpenAPI file. When people are using our GitHub integration, where you can have all the content of your GitBook into a GitHub repositories and Markdown files, you can also use this to have the OpenAPI file into a GitHub repository. So for example, I have this GitHub repository where there is a readme.md and my openapi.yaml file. I can reference the OpenAPI file this way to insert a block. So in my Markdown, at different point of time, I can just reference the file and it will automatically work. So I can show you the space. So this one is the same content, but coming from GitHub. And if I change the content on GitHub, for example, by changing the slash post on the pet, by inserting a new pet, let's say dog or cat, to the store, I can commit this change. And if my demo is working correctly, it will be updated into GitBook automatically. That's always a challenge with demos on real time. Yeah, I might need to update the readme.md. I'm extremely sorry about this. I can also reference another endpoint. So for example, if I pass put this method here and I commit this change will trigger an import to GitBook. I might have disabled the GitHub integration. Oh no, it's synchronizing. So it's synchronizing, and yeah, I can see the add a new pet dog or cat here, and I have my other endpoint below. In that case, the file is here, and if I update the file here, it will update it as well in the GitHub repository. It will push a commit with the update to the repository. So that's how a lot of our users are integrating OpenAPI into their docs, either by maintaining a file directly in GitBook or maintaining the file in GitHub and using our GitHub integration, or storing the file on their own server and referencing the URL. You can see some examples of documentation using this as, for example, MessageBird, which has a complete API documentation hosted on GitBook, or Snyk, who also is mixing their product documentation with their API, REST API documentation.
Super cool. Yeah, and that's one thing. I'm glad that you pointed it out. The kind of the integration, like the continuous development integration, where you can just reference one file, but make sure that it's always going to be updated in the docs when you reference it, either through the file or if you host it and just reference it by the URL. But yeah, I think on the other half of that, then it'd be cool to dive into the actual Scalar side of things. I don't know, Mark, if you want to give a quick kind of overview, not only about like the integration itself and how you can test out an API, but I think it'd also be cool to see just Scalar in action. If you have any demos you'd like to show.
Yeah, would love to. Let me just quickly share my screen. Sec. Okay, can everyone see my screen, or is there an infinite window?
No, we see it. Looks good.
Okay, cool. So just a quick background on Scalar. This is our open source repo, so you can go to github.com/scalar/scalar and see it. So the whole thing with Scalar is you give us an open API specification and we'll render you beautiful open API documentation. Our big thing too is we integrate with a lot of your server frameworks. So this is more so if you're doing backend development, you can go and get started really simply by just adding a few lines of code. For example, this is our CDN bit and this is just our Galaxy specification. So we render stuff here, but the big one is the test request functionality. And so when Samy reached out to me in, I think it was in November or maybe even October when we launched, one of the biggest feature requests, or a really big one for GitBook, was testing functionality. And we have this really deeply integrated testing, small little API client right inside of your docs. So this is the bit that now if you go into GitBook and you've uploaded your open API spec and you click the test it button, we now have the ability to test endpoints right inside of GitBook now, which is really exciting. And it's all based on your open API spec. So I'm just going to stick to the Galaxy demo here. But some of the cool features we have out of the gate are it's all based on your open API spec. So depending on the authentication you have, I actually know that there was a GitHub discussion created this morning about multiple auths. So we're going to be adding that so you can have more than one. But we have basic bare API auth 2. We have cookie support. Depending on the body that you're going to be sending, we automatically add the content type. We also support multi-part form, binary files, and we also change the content type on the fly. And this all happens for you automatically. And the whole idea is to minimize onboarding time for your users. So when they're going to the docs, they have beautiful documentation by GitBook. The other bit too is they want to be able to maybe test the endpoints right inside the docs. So you can test it right there, and we showcase what actually comes from your live API, which is really cool. And there's a breakdown of header, cookies, body. And this is actually the new Scalar version 2 API client that we merged last night. Before it was, a lot of the big features were that it was pretty slow to open. Now it's almost instant. We have all these different variants of body types to send now. Before we just had JSON. And then there's going to be a lot more features too with auth, and auth is the big one, to be honest, like multiple auth. And so yeah, you get all this essentially for free when you add your open API block. So it's a really exciting feature that we're stoked to have integrated inside of GitBook. And yeah.
Yeah, it's super cool. I know that I've used it a bunch, and I know our users are also super happy that this was something that was able to be made done. And to kind of just the point of this whole webinar as well, tying back this whole like open source discussion, like I think this is a feature that would have been a lot harder to do if we hadn't kind of both approached it from an open source angle. So really cool. Let us know also in the comments if you're using it or if you have any questions on it. But did you want to say something, Samy?
Yeah, I think to reflect back a bit more on like how we started this partnership, when we built the first API block years ago, it was lacking a lot of features. We received a lot of feedback on it, and one of the most common feedback was, is it possible to let people try directly the API from the documentation? As you can see in some API documentation like Stripe or some world-class API docs, you want end users to be able to test the API there. You don't want them to go into another tool or to have to kind of download some code or to have to go into a code editor. You want them to be able to see the API and to see if it works and to test it with their credential directly in. So we reached out to Marc to see, okay, is it possible to integrate Scalar? Because for us, building such a feature would have been a long time and not our core business. We want to focus on the core of the product. We want to build a great experience around documentation. And what the Scalar team has been doing on API and building a lot of tooling around open API has been amazing. And for us, it was perfect to just integrate to combine the two tools. And there's a lot more stuff that we want to integrate deeper in the future, because right now, I mean, Mark mentioned the authentication, but we also want to make sure that if you have authentication on your side and you want to kind of pass it down to the documentation. So for example, if one of your users is on your product and is authenticated on your product and opens the documentation, you want to make sure that they can have directly some API tokens into their documentation so that they don't have to go fetch an API token somewhere, but they can just directly try it on the API and test the API directly inline. So that's stuff that we want to improve on over the next few months, and to build more features around this and to make the integration even deeper, to make sure that at the end the whole API documentation experience will be close to perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's really exciting to hear as well, to see how and what is built over the next couple months between the two companies. Let's dive into some of the Q&A as well. I know there was a few questions that were asked, but I think, most of these we should be able to answer. So we can kind of start down the list. The first one's also pretty interesting. It's going over licenses. So what kind of licenses do you like, and which do you think is the best? I know, Mark, that you've built a lot of different open source tools. Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, no, it's a hot topic. I feel like it depends very much so. I think for us, we're MIT licensed just because we wanted it to be as permissive as possible, and how we're like all the paid features that we're going to be shipping. We kind of alluded to, we're shipping a dedicated app for testing APIs, and so we felt strongly that everything that's going to be open source that is in the Scalar repo can be is always going to be offline first, and all the paid features are going to be outside of it. So when we were kind of looking at MIT GPL, it just kind of made sense for us to just do MIT license. But I know that there's some interesting licenses around. I think Meta did one with their open source models, where I think if you're making more than $1 million a year in revenue, or if you have like the models, like the weights and everything is open source and free to use commercially. But then if your business is making more than $1 million ARR, then you have to start paying for it, which I think is an interesting and reasonable license. That's kind of my take.
Just following up on this question, I'm curious, Mark, on how much have you looked at kind of how other open source companies were looking at licenses? I know that Sentry had a very unique model on licensing, but HashiCorp had a lot of stuff these past few months around license and open source license. Where you got some feedback, or did a comparison of the license? Did you try to look at kind of what the next few years will look like, or what driven the choice of MIT?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of big conversations around, like, HashiCorp is probably like the biggest one, especially with this year. It's a very complicated and question. And for us, when we were looking ahead of like how we're going to monetize the product and how we're going to distribute it, it made the most sense for Scalar as a business to be MIT licensed. And I think I couldn't imagine the scale of decision or thought around like companies that maybe it's not as clear about how they're monetizing their products. So yeah, for Scalar, MIT made the most sense, just to be as permissive as possible, specifically because all of the paid features are going to be something that hooks into the Scalar open source products versus something that's like we won't be shipping. Yeah, it just made the most sense for our business. So we were lucky in that regard, I guess.
Cool. The next question is it's something specific, I think, to the integration. Joseph is asking about if the integration supports an array of server objects. If you're able to switch servers, if the Open API file contains an array of target servers.
So I can answer that on the way we render open API operation in the documentation. It's not yet supported. That's something that we have in the roadmap. That is in our issue tracker and something that we will build. The repository is open source, so if anyone wants to contribute into building it, it's obviously more than welcome. But yeah, that's on the rendering part, and I don't know on the when the user click try it and on the Scalar side of things. I don't know, Mark, if you have more insight there.
Yeah, we have like a server picker in the address bar for the testing client, so you can choose between servers, and then it'll be the first one is the default one. But I think there's some issues we're having with like no, I think in the V2 it's all working well. So yeah, you can pick the servers from there, but yeah, maybe I'll contribute to the GitBook one.
This is also a pretty interesting question also. So there's a question about basically when do you ever go, this isn't worth open sourcing? Because it sounds like there's a big mentality about starting from an open source perspective, but for either of you two or both, yeah, is there ever a point where you don't go from the open source kind of route? Is there any like main characteristics of a product or thing that you're building that goes down that road?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer first. For us, it kind of depends on what specifically we're trying to focus our efforts on too, because there is the side of it, if it's closed source, then it's just you that's looking at it, you that's maintaining it, you that's interfacing with it. I think there is, for example, all of our backend stuff, all of our infrastructure code is all closed source. I don't know if it would make the most sense today or in a year to ever to open source that. Not to say that we wouldn't. There's a lot of examples of companies doing a great job with that. Like I think Posthog is one. So maybe they have a good sense of like, but they're like super open source, which is amazing. But I think for us, it's just kind of where we think the most value we can provide to the community and where they can have the most impact on that's most prevalent to the product at hand. So open sourcing the backend wouldn't be necessarily beneficial yet for the product we're shipping.
Yeah, I think the main question I think needs to be considered when we look at this is who is going to benefit from it being open source, and how are we going to benefit from it as a company, and how are our users going to benefit from it? So if there is value that our users will get by accessing the code or accessing the way it works, and it should be open source. I think when we look at backend and for example, in the case of GitBook, I would say 90% of GitBook is closed source, and our entire backend is closed source. The main reasons is it helped us iterate faster when we were building it a few years ago, because we could just be like a bunch of engineers quickly committing on it, not really thinking about like how the code will look like from the outside or how to kind of explain it to an external audience, and also on the choice of technology that we made. We choose to go with a lot of serverless technologies, a lot of cloud-based technologies, where if we wanted our backend to be open source, we'll have to make different choices, because if you make it open source, then you aim at the code to be run somewhere else, to be run by someone who is not part of the company, which is right now something that we don't want to optimize for, because what we want to optimize for is the performance and the reliability of the experience for the end users. So making it open source will not help us in that goal. But if I had to redo it again, I would probably have kept GitBook open source for a lot longer, or maybe entirely along the way, because I think it also helps to take different technical decisions, which sometimes are harder, but are better for the long term.
Cool. And there's just one last quick question as well, which is, are there plans that GitBook renders the schema blocks from an open API file? It sounds like it's a request from Joseph and some of the customers that they have as well.
So no, there is no plan for it at the moment, but I think it would be very interesting for us to kind of deep dive a bit more into the use case. The way we approach it is when we take an open API file, we don't want to render the entire open API file. So we don't want to kind of render all the operation and all the schema, but we want to render the piece that you are choosing to render. So right now it could only be operation, but it could be interesting at some point to evaluate what it is to kind of render more like schema parts and documenting types in your documentation through linking directly to Open API. But it's not part of our short-term / mid-term plans at the moment. But we're always happy to reconsider our roadmap based on feedback and use cases.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for also asking some great questions. Thank you also, Marc and Samy, for some great discussion on open source, GitBook, Scalar, and kind of just the whole ecosystem on how we ended up where we are now. There's actually a pretty interesting question from Slava in the chat, which kind of ties up what I wanted to kind of finish up the webinar with. Slava was asking about if it's possible to document different products in one GitBook project. And I think it'd be interesting, Samy, if you wanted to talk maybe just a little bit about what we have coming next. It sounds like Slava would actually benefit a lot from some of the things that we're working on currently.
Yeah, I think these comments perfectly aligned with kind of our direct roadmap. So right now, the entire focus for us at GitBook is improving the experience of publishing documentation and API documentation to a public audience. So that's the main thing we are focusing on. So we want to offer more customization options. So more way to for example, customize the way icons are being rendered or some characteristics of pages, for example, how they index on Google, how they index into search, are they visible in the table of content. So a lot more features around customizing basically and having more control on your documentation. And we also want to ship a way to organize content as for organization who are documenting multiple products under one documentation website. So we have customers who are documenting, who have like product 1, product 2, product 3, and then different versions for their products. So we want to make sure that they can structure this as different variants and have very complex navigation and complex structure representing the complexity of their actual product. So that's some stuff that we are building at the moment. So we are rethinking the whole way of publishing content on GitBook to provide a complete solution that we call sites. That will offer a lot more features around customization, but also around the way to organize content. That's our main focus for the next few months, and then we have a lot more planned around improving the change request for review process and improving how we integrate with Scalar and how we build better API documentation on GitBook.
Awesome. And Marc, any exciting things that you can give some insight into what you and the team are working on?
Yeah, for sure. We're really excited to be delivering more features for all the wonderful GitBook users, and specifically around the testing part of Scalar. So there's a lot of small things that we want to make better around environment variables, feeding in auth, pre-request scripts, also multiple auth is like a really big one. That's probably one of our biggest requests right now. So that's going to be worked on very soon. And then the really big one is we're going to be releasing our standalone API client app. So that'll be an Electron app, similar to, you can just test endpoints locally with a deep integration with OpenAPI. So that's like, I think we're sending out early access invites tomorrow, which I'm really excited about. So, and obviously, anyone here who would like access can, maybe we'll do a follow-up email or something, but I'm really excited about that. It's pretty much what you see in the try it out functionality, but in a standalone app with a lot more features.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super exciting to hear. And I'm pretty excited to see where what's launched later this year. But yeah, thank you again for everyone who had joined in. Hopefully you learned something new and got a better insight into open source and how both teams here are approaching it. Thank you again, Marc and Samy, for joining and the thoughtful discussion. Yeah, and thank you if you're watching this async. We hope again that you learned something new, but feel free to follow Marc or GitBook on Twitter. We're posting all the time, and be sure to stay up to date with everything that's coming out over the next couple months. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, Marc.